Welcome back to the pharmaphorum podcast. In today's episode, I speak with Farrell Simon, Chief Commercial Officer at Trevi Therapeutics, who shares his personal and ever patient-focused journey to his current position at the company and explores recent clinical development in the chronic cough space. A unique condition and disease that needs to be addressed and asked about by physicians, Farrell sees positive developments coming in the next 5 to 10 years. Tune in, discover more, and as ever, thank you for listening. Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Farrell Simon, Chief Commercial Officer at Trevi Therapeutics. Today, we'll be discussing prioritising patients in clinical and commercial development, looking in particular at chronic cough and the status of the treatment landscape and clinical trials for addressing what is yet an unmet need. Chronic cough impacts up to 10% of the adult population and has a physical, psychological, and social impact on patients' lives. There are currently no approved therapies in either the US or the UK for what is a highly disruptive affliction, accompanied by a wide range of complications which causes a significant burden on patients, caregivers, and healthcare systems. But before we launch into our main theme, Farrell, perhaps you could tell listeners a little bit more about yourself, about your journey to doing what you do today with Trevi Therapeutics.
Yeah, well, Nicole, very nice to see you, and thank you very much for having me. As I started my career many years ago, it was really focused around patients and how do we help patients. I was always a carer throughout my life, or whether that my grandfather when I was young, whether that was my father when he unfortunately had a battle with cancer and unfortunately lost his battle to that. But I always had the intersection of science and business as a key focus. And that really led my education, where I went and got a doctor of pharmacy as well as a master's of business administration and launched my career in the pharmaceutical field. Started off in very small, call it retail chains, and worked my way after college to larger corporations such as Procter and Gamble and Pfizer prior to joining Trevi Therapeutics a number of years ago. So there's always been a focus on how do you help patients? How do you figure out that unmet need? And how do you prioritize them throughout different stages of development? And I think I learned that in different lessons across my career in different ways.
Thank you also for sharing your personal journey to what you do today. So if we focus on today's main theme, perhaps you could, first of all, explain for listeners what chronic cough is and indeed refractory chronic cough, or RCC, and how these specifically impact patients' lives.
Yeah, so when we look at chronic cough, the guideline definition, so what physicians look for in terms of guidance, is an adult who has suffered for greater than 8 weeks. And that is a very broad definition of chronic cough. And that can be caused from a variety of different causes. When you start to break down the categories a little more and look at patients and say, why are they coughing? The two areas that we're looking at are, one, as you mentioned, Nicole, refractory chronic cough. This is a patient who has an underlying condition such as asthma, such as heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease or postnasal drip. And they've been treated for their current condition, but still have this debilitating condition of chronic cough. There's also other categories in chronic cough that are caused by more, call it structural impacts. And that is another category in which we're studying, which is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, where a majority of those patients also have chronic cough. And unfortunately, that's a terminal disease where patients live about 3 to 5 years. But chronic cough has different impacts on those patients. And it's also a marker potentially for disease progression or worse health outcomes in those patients.
So there's clearly a need for a successful treatment for these, Farrell. But what's the current landscape like? And also going to, I believe Trevi Therapeutics has developed its own, as you've been alluding to, potential treatment, which is now in phase 2, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nicole. So when you look at the current treatment landscape, and I'll just break it down to the two categories that we look at and we set up the refractory chronic cough category. There's been interest from a number of companies in this space. And unfortunately, most of those have failed. And there's a number of hypotheses why that could occur. Some of those are agents that only work in the lung. And some of the challenges with that is when you only work in the lung, you could be an oral medication that acts in the lung, you can be an inhaled medication that acts only in the lung. But when you work in the lung, you have to work on the exact cause of that cough. And if you miss that exact cause, you unfortunately don't treat a lot of patients. So you don't have broad coverage over a lot of these refractory chronic cough patients. And there are hypotheses that that could be causing some of the unfortunate failures in this space. There are other agents, such as ours, oral nalbuphine ER. And when you look at that, we work both peripherally in the lung, but we also work centrally. And by working in the central nervous system, it works independent of what that trigger may be in the lungs. And so we had really good success. And as you said, we had success in the other category of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And so we have a trial in refractory chronic cough. And then I think when we look at the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and the chronic cough category within that, there really has not been a lot of development. And so this is a significant unmet need in both of these categories, but there's really a focus there to help these patients because not only is it debilitating to their quality of life, but it's also potentially leading to worse health outcomes such as respiratory hospitalizations or mortality. And so we are progressing our compound into a phase 2B. So we had really good success in phase 2A of earlier development.
So, if we stick with this and the sort of lack, as it were, of tangible development in the area, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the sort of general status of clinical trials for meeting such an unmet need. And off the back of that, how one can perhaps work better with patients in clinical development to deliver better outcomes and meaningful therapies in this area.
Yeah, so clinical development, it's great to see that in both of these areas there is clinical development because as you set up, this is an area of high unmet need across chronic cough. And one of the areas that we always look at and that the category has looked at in the past is we measure cough by an objective monitor that gets placed on a patient. It's not invasive, but it gets placed on a patient and monitors their cough for a period of time. And that's really good from an objective viewpoint of what is the therapy doing to help the patient in terms of reducing their cough frequency. But there are a number of other measures that are important to the patient. And this gets back to your question of how do you work closer with patients? How do you work closely with government agencies and health authorities to develop patient reported outcomes that are meaningful to patients and that are consistently measured throughout clinical development? Because by bringing that patient voice in early, you're able to really hone in on what's meaningful to them. And then you can just develop a set of questionnaires, right? That holistically look at the patient rather than just one aspect of what cough may be doing on their lives. And I think that's what the category is focused on today is what is a patient reported outcome that's meaningful to them on their physical, their psychological, the social impact of cough that they can report, that they can tell us how did they feel over the last, call it 24 hours, on how well a therapy is or isn't working for them. Because if you reduce their cough frequency, that's one aspect. But if they don't feel better from that reduction of cough frequency, you really haven't helped the patient progress in terms of their quality of life. And so you want all those measures going in the same direction. And that's something that I think is really important in clinical development. So what we've done, I think, a little bit differently is we've integrated that patient voice as we've looked at our trial. We have integrated that into our education materials. And when we look at participants, we call, patients who are participating in clinical trials, how do they read the materials? Are the materials easily understood, not just in terms of what the trial design may be or how often they need to come in for their study visits, but along the way of How do they look at the patient-reported outcomes? How many of those is burdensome to them within a trial? So that we balance that to make sure their voice is heard and that we're designing these trials for our ultimate stakeholder, which is the patient. Because if we develop a therapy and unfortunately are unable to get it approved and into their hands, we have failed in some regard. And so we want to make sure that they're part of that journey every step of the way.
Absolutely. So I think the only question left to ask, Farrell, is what next? I mean, in terms of the unfolding of time for this treatment landscape in the next 5 or 10 years, but also the sort of hope on the horizon with a more distant view for the treatment's availability and the ultimate outcomes for patients.
Yeah, I think, in the next couple of years, as we said, there's a lot of development. And I think one of the key things is educating patients on the importance of clinical trials and how much we can partner together to better understand the potential therapies in that therapeutic landscape. And so we have developed materials within that realm of why is it important that patients participate in clinical trials. And by getting those patients into trials, we can progress therapies quicker because then you have the ability to access them to try your product right as safe and effective therapies on them throughout clinical development. And you said in the next 5 years, we hope to start seeing some of these therapies come to market. And there's such an unmet need. There is a wide landscape of therapies that can come to market. I think if you look at the potential of our therapy in the next 5 years, you would hope to see, the potential that we would have the possibility of coming to market, of course, with the right trials, the right trial outcomes and regulatory approvals. But you also took a look at the next, call it 10 years on the horizon, that patients have a selection of therapies because what's available for them today is not meeting their unmet need. They don't work across a broad range of patients. They don't have a very strong depth of response. So even if you take it, it doesn't reduce your cough significantly. And I think there's a natural migration within this category of chronic cough that cough is more than just a symptom. It is a unique condition and disease that needs to be addressed, that needs to be asked about by physicians, and that needs to really set the landscape of an important unmet need as a condition. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll make that transition. I think a number of the key physicians within this space have done a really nice job of bringing that to the forefront because that will lay the groundwork for why these therapies are important and why it's important to get them into the patient's hands because they're in a great dire of need right now.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Nicole.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.